Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. We have an unusual program tonight. We have Jack Ryan Jr., right? Today's, and the echo chamber over there. Hang on a minute. Maybe, Patrick, we should see if we can persuade them not to converse. Thanks. Let me start over again. We have Jack Ryan Jr., who is a modern warrior. I guess we could call him a warrior. Can we call him a warrior?
Absolutely.
Oh, good. Okay. And then we're going to hear about Julius Caesar, one of the great strategists, really a genius in so many respects. And is this your new translation of the War on Gaul? And for those of you who didn't see it, and I'll stick it a link in the e-news, the Wall Street Journal last Saturday wrote a wonderful piece about Caesar as a tactician, not as a statesman, more definitely as a warrior.
He was successful in everything he did.
Right up until the middle of March, right? He was a fascinating man, and actually in that article, more ruthless than I had previously supposed.
Entirely, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And the middle of March, that was a successful. If you wanted to get off stage, that was about as memorable and dramatic a way to do so as anyone could have found.
I never considered it that way. it was a little young, I thought, for such a dramatic exit. But
great production values.
No, it did, and obviously he's the man who really changed Rome because he paved the way for Augustus Caesar and the emperors that followed. And I think he would have been horrified, frankly, if the emperors that followed, because most of them were inept.
Yeah. That would be a nice word for it. Yeah.
Okay.
I'd say there were about a half a dozen who made it over the course of 500 years. That's not a real good.
Well, a couple of them were actual generals, like Vespasian, for example, who had been successful. But then we have Nero as another, whatever it is. So do you think that Jack Ryan Jr., stands in this long line of incredible warriors all the way from, let's go back, we go to Alexander and even earlier, right? Back to the Persians, the Greeks.
Yeah, I mean, I think in Western culture and Western civilization, we've long heralded the warrior. The warrior holds a great fascination for us in our culture and therefore in our literature. First and foremost because we have historical examples. And I just, what you just said, 6 good emperors and how many hundreds of 1,000 years. It's amazing that they survived that long. I mean, it says something about the Roman Empire.
Matter of fact, people worry about the fall of the Roman Empire. The amazing thing is it lasted as long as it did.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess we can survive a confederacy of dunces as long as we need to.
That's one way of putting it.
Right. Well, I mean, there's always that speculation, what would have happened if Caesar had lived long enough to be dictator for life, and what kind of system would he have set up? But that's not really the purpose of Jim's book, which is to talk about the War on Gaul, which today we commonly call France, but was not. What did it embrace territorially?
His Gaul is everything that's France, but up to the Rhine River. So it includes some of Belgium, Netherlands, a little bit of Germany.
Right.
And that the Rhine was where he felt you could defend against onrushing barbarians.
Well, it was a natural barrier anyway. Beyond their way, dark woods and people in furs, and I mean, no, seriously, they really were. But Spain was a different territory, right?
Spain is separated by the mountains, and so it was a different story. They had gotten some of it from the Carthaginians, and they gradually worked their way out to the Atlantic over a couple centuries.
Yeah, I visited some of the great Roman ruins in Spain and in Portugal, and they're deeply impressive. So there we go. All right, well, let's go back and talk about Jack Ryan Jr. Last time we talked about a Tom Clancy book, it was Jack Ryan Sr., because Mark Cameron was here. And it reminded me that he is a Republican president, still going strong, but the object would be to keep politics out of these books, right, and focus on the mission.
Yeah, overall, I think that one of the things that the whole Clancy series does is try to be realistic, and there are things like Republicans and Democrats, and so I think some of that comes in. So it's less about policy so much as straight up politics. So things like human ambition, which I think would include things all the way back to the time of Caesar, all the way up to Jack Ryan Sr. And so I think politicians and political ambition and political incompetence competence, and everything in between is fair game in a book that's involved with military techno thrillers, because military action and the thriller action and all that takes place in a context, and the context primarily is politics.
Well, Mark has a different mission in that his guy is the president, and Jack Ryan Jr. is an operative.
And the son of the president, yeah. So
right. Well, he is, but nonetheless, he's not actually in office. He is
exactly.
still
yeah, and he has no aspiration for office, and I talk about that quite a bit. And he has no interest for that, and he wants to stay away from it. But in reality, when he's dispatched on any kind of a mission, I mean, he's stealing from Clausewitz, right? I mean, war is politics by their means. Well, so is covert action. Covert action is politics by their means. So it's always a political decision that is initiating either the bad guy's behavior or the good guy's behavior.
Does he represent any sort of extra threat to his team? Being the son of the president, would he be a more natural target for some of the bad guys?
Well, that's a fascinating question. There are some conventions of the Jack Ryan Jr. series. Somehow.
That's okay. We all suspend disbelief when we read these.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you for suspending disbelief. I love Jack Ryan Jr. I love the series, but the reality is somehow a man named Jack Ryan Jr. is not identified as the president of Jack Ryan, or the son of Jack Ryan Sr., and he's not recognized. And so, and some of the things we do, for example, we'll have Jack, like, he wears a beard, he combs his hair a different way, he wears contacts. So he tries to eliminate that. His father went out of the way to keep his children out of the public limelight. So, yeah, we're pushing up pretty hard against credulity, but we're trying to paint the picture that, because if everyone knew he was the son of the president, then you'd have to have an armed contingent of Secret Service agents around him 24/7, and that'd be kind of cool, but a different kind of story than the.
He wouldn't be much of a secret agent, would he?
No, yeah, kind of hard. Him and his 20 best friends sneaking through the rose garden.
Absolutely true. Actually, I think it was the Wall Street Journal today, but I'm sure it was, rather than the Arizona Republic, had a fascinating article about the Chinese. Facial recognition techniques are now being used by the Chinese for an incredible amount. So even if he were adept at putting in contact lenses and other things, as facial recognition software becomes more and more skilled, that's not going to buy him a lot.
The technology on facial recognition has galloped away from us. It really has. I mean, when I was doing the drone series that was coming up, 5 years ago, Hitachi had a system that could identify the entire population of Canada in 1 second. The Chinese are claiming they can do their entire population in 2 seconds now. So it's growing exponentially, but 36 million in a second is still pretty fast. So this idea that everyone can be seen and known and recognized and tracked. And what's even scarier is it's not like, you're at the ATM, you're sticking your face in the camera and take a picture. These algorithms now and the AI, some of the AI software behind it is able to take a quarter of a face with a shadow on it and interpolate what that face might be, and it's still pretty accurate. So, and that's just the face. These systems can track walking. Every human being has a different kind of a gait. So there are systems that track the gait and can identify you by the way you walk. I mean, it's just amazing. We are known, and we are observed, and we are recorded 24/7, 365.
Every time I go through global reentry, I frown at the camera. Give it a test. I have the fingerprint backup, so there we are. But I mean, it's a fascinating thing, for us as individuals to think about privacy versus convenience, or privacy versus access. For example, the Chinese are using it for banking and other stuff. But it seems to me it's also going to pose a real challenge for people who are writing, spy stories, because it's going to be harder and harder for people to do the old, trench coat and dark glasses and fake passport thing.
Yeah, I'm starting to envy Alan First.
Yeah,
and the other
exactly.
pre-World War II guys. Yeah, I might have to give them a call and ask for some advice. Yeah, I mean, the thing I discovered when I was writing before, even the Tom Clancy series, but certainly now, I don't think there's science fiction anymore. I mean, anything you can dream up and think about and pretend is real, it's already happening. I mean, trust me.
Boy, your early drone book, has that ever come true?
Well, yeah, and I'll tell you, probably like all of you, I certainly had the misconception that engineers were really smart and they were using like computers and advanced mathematics. What I neglected to really fully appreciate is how incredibly creative they are. that an awful lot of creative energy goes into the design of these systems, and it's just the math and the physics that work out the details. And so you simply can't outguess these brainiac engineers. You just can't do it. And the Chinese in particular are plowing enormous resources into these technologies, like Huawei, the big
Right.
controversy with 5G. Did I read the other day? I think Huawei employs 900 physicists dedicated just for the 5G project. I mean, they're very serious. They understand that technology is disruptive in every area of our lives,
Gotcha. So
particularly the military.
if I were secret agent, the bee I rescued from my pool today, I might have suspected was a miniaturized drone come to spy on me, but no, it was just a floundering bee. I feel that we have to save bees. A spider, I would have let it drown. So, over to you for a moment. Julius Caesar, did he, since we've been talking about weaponry and technology and all the rest of it, did Caesar actually implement any great advances in that over the normal Roman army centurion setup and legions?
I'm not sure he had himself technological advance, but he certainly had organization. He went up to Gaul with a staff of political agents and spies and operatives of one kind or another. And he'd win battles where he had 10,000 soldiers and the other side had uncounted 50, 75, or 100. And that was that, about 30 years before, the Roman army had turned professional. And so they had discipline and training and better weapons and more consistency, and they had an idea what they were doing. He turned that into, with organization and talent, into a real machine that could go almost anywhere and take out essentially all of the competition there was in the ancient world.
So remind us of how the Roman army was set up with the cohorts and the legions, and decimate is an actual thing that the Romans did.
Decimate, this is, you can use as a quiz question. If the general was unhappy with his troops, he would take out every 10th man and have him executed. So we tend to say decimating now is like completely wiping out, but no, but it was that strategic tool of discipline. Well, the Roman legion was about 4,500 men, broken up into centuries and cohorts so that everybody knew exactly where he was standing. Everybody knew who was on his left, everybody knew who was on his right. And as we still know, small unit bonding is really important to success on a battlefield, and as is organization. And so they could take on just about anybody. When he had his Ides of March event, he was getting ready to go to Persia to become Alexander the Great himself.
Yes.
And the great might have been, what would it have been like if Caesar had taken on Persia?
Well, it's a really good question. I mean, once he crossed the Rubicon, which is also passed into the lexicon, he was clearly a disruptor, if we want to call him that in today's parlance, and who knows where he was going.
I think the other thing to say about him is that he always knew where he was going. The whole going into Gaul, Rome sort of could use a little imperial expansion, but Caesar needed money and Caesar needed fame. And he wrote this book while he was doing it to make sure he got the fame. And he conquered lots of tribes up there to make sure he got the money. And
So he was
that's what
actually
brought him back.
a terrific writer. He was a great stylist. I was so interested in reading the article in the journal about, as a literary figure, he was just top notch.
Oh, absolutely. He wrote scholarly books about literature while he was fighting in Gaul. And he was really
Relaxing in his tent.
It is even said that he was dictating on horseback. That he had squadrons of secretaries. Ancient writers often wrote with shorthand secretaries. That he had squadrons of them, and it was one of his biographers said he could write 4 letters at once, dictating in rotation to the people around him. So he was remarkably successful in a variety of ways, but below that, he was clearly just a talent an order of magnitude beyond schlumps like us.
Some of the figures like him in history, I think the thing that distinguishes them is their incredible organizational, administrative abilities. You can look at Henry II, Edward I, for example, Napoleon, who was, an absolute organizational genius. And the ones that fudge it, like Hitler going to Russia or something, are the guys that don't really have that,
Yeah, and there must be something mental about the capacity for mastering detail of faces and
Right.
people and that. I've met and shaken hands with Bill Clinton a couple of times, and he's different from me, I can tell. He just knows people and knows the way to work a room that is beyond my imagination.
He has his own internal facial recognition program. We already know that. No, it's fascinating. All right, so back to Jack Ryan Jr. Poland. Why Poland?
Well, that's a great question.
I'm full of them.
Yes, I know. This is my 6th year here. I believe me, I love coming here. The shorthand is last year, 2018, was the 100th anniversary of Polish independence. Poland disappeared from the maps of Europe completely from 1795 until 1918, divided up. The Germans, the Austrian Empire, and the Russians simply disappeared. And at the end of World War I, Woodrow Wilson stood up and said, I think I've got a great idea. I think the Poles need their own country. So we went to Poland in 2018, saw these amazing Polish flags, Polish patriotism, bands playing, pictures of Polish patriots. But I gotta tell you, this old American heart good to see all those American flags flapping in the wind and pictures of Woodrow Wilson and Ronald Reagan. They really understand the role that we played in their history. And the reason why that's satisfying to me is because Polish history to me is utterly fascinating. They're among the most heroic and tragic and long-suffering people of all of Europe. By my count, they have saved Western civilization 3 times, going all the way back to the Siege of Vienna in 1683 when the Ottoman Empire was besieging Vienna. All was lost and the Ottoman Turks were poised to take over the rest of Europe, and here come the winged hussars. The shining knights with the eagle feathers screaming in the wind, and King Jan Sobieski of Poland leading the way and smashed the Turks and saved Vienna.
Good, right? The Gates of Vienna. That's a famous, battle commentary. They got the gates and were repulsed.
And they have many other heroic examples of that. You fast forward, for example, to 1920. I defer to the historian in the room, depending on who you believe and what numbers you're willing to accept. But perhaps as many as 750,000 Soviets, part of which was the newly formed Red Army, still fighting the Civil War, were surging into Europe. And at the Battle of Warsaw in 1920, Field Marshal Piłsudski pulled off what has been described in J.F.C. Fuller's classic work on great battles as possibly the single greatest battle in Western civilization that no one knows about. In that his barefoot soldiers smashed a much larger Soviet army, I think 30,000 cavalry. If he'd not done that, they were poised to pour into Western Europe and possibly as far as the Atlantic. And so if you think of Stalin and the Cold War after World War II and what happened there, that would have happened 25 years earlier in perhaps all of Europe, but the Poles stopped them. And of course, the end of the Soviet Union, the end of Soviet communism began where? Arguably, the fuse was lit in the shipyards of Gdansk, Poland, and Lech Walesa. And so to me, I love Polish history and Polish people, and I thought, well, by Gumby, I'm a writer and I get to write what I want. I'm going to write about Poland, so that's my
For you,
answer.
and there's interesting stuff going on there. There's a sort of hard right faction and other stuff in Poland, so it's not a quiet place.
Well, because I'm a fiction writer, I can say things and get away with it that a historian can't, but I would argue that very often the history of modern Europe is the history of Poland. Whatever's going on there tells you a lot about what's going on. And the whole question of globalism versus nationalism, which I think is probably going to be the defining issue of the next 30 years in the Western world, the fault line right now is through Poland. And the Polish people, also the Hungarians, to another extent the Czechs. The question is, do we want to be part of a larger European borderless conglomeration, or do you want to be an independent nation state? Where you maintain your language and culture. So back to even why you asked me about Poland, how do you disappear from the map for 123 years, where your people are literally persecuted, where your children are not allowed to study language in school? How do you maintain your language and your culture, your national identity, in another kind of borderless world, where there's no borders for Poland, Poland's gone? And so this question of what does it mean to be, for example, what does it mean to be a citizen in a globalist world? What does patriotism mean if borders don't matter? These are the kinds of questions I really want to kind of play with, or at least raise in this novel.
A question for the historian is one of the reasons Poland has had this back and forth is it doesn't have any natural boundaries, or am I wrong?
It has no natural boundaries.
That's what I was thinking.
It
Just go back and forth over it, unimpeded.
It adjoins Ukraine, where my in-laws come from.
Right.
And Ukraina, do you know what that means in Ukrainian?
No.
Means borderland.
Oh, okay.
The name of the area is borderland, and they've been maybe a little less heroic, but they've been at least as beleaguered as the Poles for being stuck in that place between more mountains to the west and the wide open steppes to the east, from which various people have come over time.
Both directions, yeah.
Yeah, if you do any of this ancestry, DNA stuff, that's the most mixed up, confused, race mixed place on the planet, because people have been fighting back and forth over that land for thousands of years.
And fighting in part for another reason that I wanted to raise in this book is the issue of since at least the time of the Mongols, if not earlier, to Napoleon, to Hitler, to Stalin, the idea of uniting the Eurasian landmass. That if you could unite from Atlantic and the Portugal all the way to Vladivostok in the Pacific, that would be the single largest and unmatched political and economic and military power on the planet. And whoever would control a united Eurasian landmass would be the global dictator. And that has been a dream of dictators for many years, and one of the issues I've raised in this book is the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. I don't know if you've heard of that or followed it, but the long and the short is that Chinese have sort of reimagined a united Eurasian economic entity that would control 2/3 of the world's population and 40% of the GDP through trade negotiations and funding through Chinese development banks. And it's going on right now. They're very successful. Poland has actually signed one of those agreements. I think 16 different East European nations have signed it. It's a real deal, and the Chinese are very serious about it. President Xi Jinping launched this as an official doctrine in 2013. It's the central platform, the central strategic plan of China, and they're carrying it out, and not just in Europe, but also in Africa.
Africa. I was going
It's
to say, I know
fascinating,
they've
yeah.
been really hard at work in Africa,
Absolutely
building
fascinating.
infrastructure and other things. And they're not. They have a lot more control of what they're doing through their government machinery, and so they can pursue this in a more. In fact, Barrett was having that conversation last night with Steve, talking about the battle at, I can't remember the name of the bridge, but the dragon show. Hanwha, thank you. That it was an overbuilt bridge, that because the communists were able to throw everything at it, they built a bridge that was over-designed and overbuilt, and therefore almost impossible to knock out back then with conventional falling bombs, right? Do I have that right?
Yeah, it was preceded by the French colonial bridge, which an architecture friend described as elegant. And then the Vietnam War bridge was on steroids. It took 3,000-pound laser-guided bombs and a lot of them to destroy that bridge. So it really is a lesson for the ages.
Right. So elegant wasn't nearly as useful in wartime as right. The Chinese, with the same sort of government structure, are able to do that, right?
Very much so, and without making any political commentary on Chinese political philosophy or the Communist Party, the Chinese government does have the advantage of having a kind of seeming unity of purpose, right. A clearer sense of national identity, national interest. Arguably, they've been pursuing essentially the same argument since at least the Warring States period. This is not new for them. This is not a bright idea someone concocted in a policy paper in 2013. The Chinese have had a pretty elevated and clear sense of their destiny as, their place under heaven, as it were, leading the nations of the planet because they are superior to the rest for several hundred years. And now it's just, and Belt Road Initiative seems to be just a variant of that kind of philosophy and
Well, it's
policy.
really true. They got derailed in the 19th century by colonialism, but now they're back on track. Even they're uninterrupted by elections and various other things, they are able to.
Oh, they have elections.
Well-
99% turnout and 100%, yeah. And
Right. They are able to pursue a unified goal in a way that, we're certainly not in our political structure, or God knows Britain currently with its political structure
Right.
is able to do. I mean, when you watch the UK can't figure out how to do Brexit, and the Chinese are going, it's a real comment.
And so what do you do then with the new Chinese system, the facial recognition system, which has been, as you suggested, deployed to basically create and enforce the idea of ideal Chinese citizens? So I don't know if you're aware, but there's a social ranking system. And so if you're the kind of person that visits the wrong kinds of websites, or you read Tom Clancy books, or you do questionable things in terms of Chinese government, you're ranked or technically deranked. And I think last year tens of thousands of people, for example, couldn't buy airline tickets or rail tickets because of their social standing. And I have no desire whatsoever to engage in a system like that. So don't hear me saying that I'm advocating this. But think of the genius and the will and the intentionality of a government that says we are going to basically design the ideal system and punish the ones who aren't. It gives you the idea of the kind of will that is involved with the Chinese government. And whether you like them or not, they are going to move forward on their agenda, and they are not going to be stopped by something as difficult and problematic as Western liberal democracy and voting and democracy.
Let me do a little
Over
bit
here.
of ancient historian
Right.
on China. The Roman Empire gets put together over several hundred years. And then the wheels come off the car, and it's not the Roman Empire anymore, and it begets nationalisms of various kinds. I'm a Latin professor, so I like to say that the people in France don't know that they're still speaking Latin. It's just a latent, corrupt form of Latin with a lot of misspellings. But the Chinese have had ups and downs, but China managed to create China, the body on the landmass, out of a whole lot of nationalities and regions and climates and all sorts of stuff a very long time ago. And that blob on the map is still in your mind right now. It's in your mind. You can see it. You can visualize it. If I ask you all to visualize Rome right now, you got a city with bridges and pasta. You're not thinking about all of Western Europe as though it were Rome. And just keeping that notion of China gives them an advantage when they're up that they can then build on by pushing further west from a lot further out from the coast and otherwise. And that's a 2,000-year successful strategy.
And it's not even that they have just a cultural or philosophical attitude about it. They write policy papers. Their generals make statements quoting generals from the Warring States period. They're actively drawing from this ancient history as the model for future behavior. Whereas in the West, we're questioning absolutely everything about our history and the validity of it. I mean,
I can't make Europe a stable Europe thing that acts together. For all that strategically in those terms, it would be good if you could.
Right.
And that's not a political judgment, it's just a strategic judgment. You'd be better off if you had a large, coordinated body of people and resources working closely together.
and not to beat a dead horse, but the whole idea also of the Belt Road Initiative, originally some of the titles were the Silk Road Initiative. So going all the way back to, remember Marco Polo and all that. So the Chinese are even heralding in their trade policy and their economic policy back to these ancient periods and trying to reestablish literally the same routes, but now instead of dirt or stones, it's high-speed rail and 18-wheel trucks.
To your comments about intentionality and so forth, that was what distinguished Rome for a while, and certainly distinguished Caesar, was that.
Oh, absolutely.
Rome was the most powerful engine, and it really for its time administered this incredibly large territory.
And Rome should not have succeeded. The city of Rome was in a lousy place to try to run a Mediterranean-wide empire from. Alexandria is perfectly located. Constantinople is almost perfectly located. But the Romans had the discipline and the will and some luck and they managed to establish something which then did run the world from Rome for hundreds of years.
Caesar was really a true son of Rome, and took it to a high level himself.
Well, and
right?
it was his nephew, Augustus,
Right.
who made the choice to double down on the city of Rome and Romishness, rather than relocate headquarters someplace further east. It would have been a different world if Alexandria had been the center of ancient civilization for the hundreds of years, with its tentacles into Egypt, Africa, Near East.
Right. Well, I mean, we forget now. Looking at Egypt was the breadbasket of Rome, and so was Israel. They were fertile back then,
And
in a way they are
yeah,
not today.
and Algeria and Tunisia. That's where all the food came from. For
So
great
Rome,
cities.
in some senses, was almost like the British Empire that had to import an enormous amount of stuff to keep itself going, right? Which made it
Always
more
did.
vulnerable.
Yes.
Yeah, it did. So why did Caesar go to Gaul? Remind us, since this is the war on Gaul.
Well,
his
some part of it
particular
is
book?
because it was there. Rome had been expanding. He gets assigned to be responsible for basically what is now Provence and the southern coast of, which was a connector to Spain. But he looked north and he saw lots of territory and lots of opportunity. And as I said, he needed money, he needed fame, and that was the place to find it. He pushed at one point into short visits across the Rhine into Germany and over into Britain for no military purpose whatsoever, but it read good in his book when his book got back to Rome. And his rival Pompey was building, I was thinking of it last night in Scottsdale terms, he was building Kierland in Rome, okay? From the resort all the way over to Scottsdale Road. And the year Caesar goes to England and Germany is the year Pompey was doing the grand opening of Pompey Mall back in Rome. And Caesar knew he had to do something to get attention, so what the heck, let's go to Germany, let's go to England, and let's write a book that gets back and tells people just how cool I, Caesar, am. If Caesar had been assigned to go in the other direction, we'd probably be reading his conquest of Asia Minor instead of his conquest of Gaul.
So
A
he
lot of
was,
it was
when
there.
you say assigned to, is this did the Senate have to approve wherever?
Well, the Roman government
Remind
in those
us how it
days,
worked.
yeah, was highly inefficient. It had 2 consuls every year, and as soon as they finished, they were assigned someplace else to go to govern. And there was a sort of rotating order of Africa, Spain, Gaul, the Balkans, Egypt, and so forth.
That was partly to get them out of Rome, so they couldn't be a problem for
Well,
the next.
But it was also generously designed to let them get out of Rome and make some money.
Oh.
Our retired politicians have some ways of making money. Roman politicians made money by conquering more peoples and plundering the province they were assigned. So some piece of it was just the luck of what was available the year he was being assigned. But he was a man who made his luck work for him.
I think our politicians are plundering while they're still in office. I don't think they wait until later. Yeah.
But it's easier to think somehow or other that the war on Gaul was a war for like Roman expansion rather than a personal thing for Caesar in order to gain some money and extra fame so he could go back and knock out his rivals in Rome.
But I'll go back to his luck. Anybody who tried to do what Caesar did, far and away the likeliest outcome was he wound up dead. Second likeliest outcome was he made a lot of money and retired someplace far from Rome where they couldn't prosecute. Success was actually not high on the list of likely outcomes. But Caesar believed in his star and he was right.
So did you learn anything new about him in translating this work that you previously hadn't known?
So some of you who might have taken high school Latin may find it hard to believe when I say that I read Latin because it makes my head feel good. And I read more because it makes my head feel good. I had enjoyed this book for a long time. Translating is different. And I had no idea just how good this guy was at just writing, both at writing the book, organizing the story, and for that matter, at masterminding how he arranged the story as he lived it so we'd have a good story to tell when he came back. So I think he's a bad man. Probably 1 million people died because he decided he wanted to make money and become famous. That's kind of a high price. But on the other hand, it is a brilliant and beautifully crafted book that's just a pleasure to kind of let run through your fingers and play with the individual words and get the story out of it. And I've tried to convey some of that both in the translation and in what I say about him to help make it easier.
So this book is published by Princeton University Press. Now you indicated to me you'd read some of it.
Yeah, I enjoyed it thoroughly. If you love history at all or know anything about Caesar, it's a thoroughly enjoyable read. I don't think you'll be offended. I laughed out loud a couple of times. I mean, there's some brilliant commentary, not in the way of the actual translation. Every chapter is set up with a context that tells you what's going on in Rome, and so it gives you like the political context within which this other story is taking place. Great read. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I mean, it's a very enjoyable read. I mean, great nonfiction is still great storytelling, and so Caesar wrote it, but you translated it. My Latin is not so Russian. Yeah, so thank you for that. Great read. I love it.
So did you pick up any helpful pointers for Jack Ryan Jr.?
Well, there was a Latin scholar that suggested that if you've read Caesar's commentary on the War on Gaul, he refers to Caesar sort of the third person, and it's a very interesting literary device because you wind up yourself. I mean, sort of you become Caesar. You're the one in this, and so at the end, you were joining us to think, well, what you gonna do now that you're Caesar, and how are you gonna live your life? I would just say this in all seriousness. Reading that book after having written mine, in some ways it's always the same story. It's a story of ambition, the story of greed, the story of honor, the story of patriotism, the story of tragedy, the story of Holocaust. It's the human story. It's in some ways it retells itself, it reinvents itself, but it's still the same story. Yet horrifically tragic. But the story of human history so often seems to be tragic, driven by the ambitions of particularly gifted men and sometimes women, initiating that tragedy for their own personal gain.
So thank you. Let me return that with two observations. One is slightly less serious. You can get people dead unexpectedly, like nobody I've ever seen. Right? You start the page and you have no
Dubious compliments.
You have no idea what's going to happen by the end of that page.
Oh, you're talking about the book.
This is you. But I was also struck, because I've been thinking about Caesar the Bad Man, that Jack Ryan, Sr. or Jr. is always a good man. And that's a way we frame war stories to make ourselves feel good about reading them. That we find some position to stand where we don't feel morally challenged ourselves. And that made me think of the first Tom Clancy. How many can remember the first Tom Clancy? Hunt for Red October.
Yep.
There's a good man in that book, but he's the unexpected good man. Mm-hmm. It's the Russian submarine commander. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's played by Sean Connery, and
a dead giveaway.
You root for Sean Connery. We all know how to root for Sean Connery, and that's automatically it. But even in that book, about people who could have been portrayed badly, Clancy managed to make it a story in which you had a moral place to stand while you were trying to figure out this gruesome world in which this stuff is going on.
Very, very much so. And to be perfectly candid, I mean, people do ask me, or generally, why do we keep this story going? I mean, it's another Tom Clancy story. Well, it's exactly that. People so love, especially the Jack Ryan Sr. character. He's a lodestar. I mean, he's someone you can count on to always make the right choice and do the right thing for the right reasons. And yeah, he's been around for a while, but sometimes that's comforting, you know. And I understand moral ambiguity. I understand why that's interesting and important in literature and other places in life. But sometimes I just want a good guy to be a good guy, you know, all the time. And that's what Jack Ryan does for me.
So I'm accompanied this evening by Holmes, the Bloodhound. And that's a reminder that Conan Doyle got the same way. He kept writing stories and going back to it, and we go back to reading the Conan Doyle stories because in a criminal, dark, underworldly kind of place with the wicked Professor Moriarty, Holmes gives us a place to stand to make some sense of it.
So if you subscribe to the great man theory of history, you know, which is certainly one way you can view history, whether it's made by forces or made by individuals or a confluence of them, you know, talking about these guys tonight, Caesar, Napoleon, Alexander, Jack Ryan, does tend to support, you know, the fact that one individual can in fact, you know, influence and turn historical forces.
Yeah, what is modern history without Hitler, Stalin, Mao? I mean, those were outsized
20th
characters.
century.
20th century,
Yeah.
yeah, and well now 21st because we've
Yeah.
inherited that. There was plenty of bad characters and bad blood in those times, but those are the ones that rose to the top and carried out their will, and they reshaped history as we now are experiencing it.
Well, it's that word you used, intentionality, and purpose. And I mean, it's really Caesar. We still have him among
Well,
us. We
yes,
just call
we
him
do.
something else.
As you said what you said, I was just thinking that neither Hitler nor Stalin nor Mao is as dead as we could wish right now.
That's a great point.
And there is some sense in which Mr. Caesar's undead as well. For all the weaknesses of Europe, the world Rome created has still shaped lots of
Absolutely.
what has gone on, of our sense of human community and around that lake and around that western peninsula of Eurasia.
It's always fascinated me that Napoleon wasn't French, Hitler wasn't German, Stalin wasn't Russian.
Right.
That really speaks to me of their intentionality, of the desire to enforce their will, impose their will on first a nation and then a planet. And I think human intentionality goes a long way. But it's extraordinary human abilities married to extraordinary ambition that makes that happen.
And true, and as Jim reminds us, luck. Because you can't, to some degree, luck determines if they survive long enough to, do what they did. One thing we haven't mentioned is I mentioned Poland, but what actually is happening briefly to Jack Ryan Jr. to kick off this story, which has gotten lost in these larger issues.
Well, Jack Ryan Jr., yes. Enemy Contact. It's following him, really racing across 2 continents as he's trying to keep a deathbed promise to an old friend. But at the same time, he's fighting to save NATO from an ambitious Chinese plot that's centered in Poland. And if that wasn't enough, he's also thwarting a brilliant hacker's murderous assault on the American intelligence community. And the tropes of my genre are big action set pieces with really bad guys, and the world hangs in the balance. And I make no apologies for that. I love reading that stuff. I love writing it. It's fun. I get that. But every book I'm trying to push myself further as a writer, further as an artist. I want to get better at what I do, and that means at some point I'm going to push myself to the point of absolute failure. I'm hoping that's the next book, not this one. I think we're okay still. But one of the reasons why Jack Ryan makes his deathbed promise to an old friend is because what are the stakes involved? If he doesn't keep this promise, not spoiling too much, his friend is basically an orphan at this point. If Jack doesn't keep the promise, nobody knows. But for Jack, it's the very highest stakes because he's a man of honor. And if he doesn't keep a promise that he's made, that's actually more devastating to him and more cataclysmic than the big world events that he's always involved with. So that's the tension I wanted to play with in the story. So even as he's doing the big mission stuff, in the back of his mind is, I've got to keep this promise, I'm going to do that.
So I've read Mike from the beginning, and I can say truthfully that it may be Jack Ryan and it may be Clancy's universe, but I read these as Mike Maden books, and I think that you are by far the best Tom Clancy that I know.
Oh, well, that's very kind of you.
No, I mean it sincerely.
I'm having the most fun, I'll tell you that. I'm very blessed, I'm very fortunate. I think you used the word luck before. It's better to be lucky than good. I was very fortunate Tom Colgan gave me the call and said, would you do this series? And been having a lot of fun with it. So.
Well, and you've obviously, grown as a writer, so if this gig doesn't pan out, you can have another one.
Well, there you go.
There we are.
Drone may come back, you never know.
I love Drone. It's wonderful. Well, we actually flew one around the bookstore. I know, it was so much fun. Did I ever tell you that when I was walking innocently over a bridge in Stockholm to get to this, what they call it, Gamlestan, the old part, there was this weird noise, and I looked up, and some guy was flying a drone right over us, and he wouldn't go away. It was a really unnerving feeling, it was a big drone. It wasn't like the little bumblebee I mentioned, but you could see it. I think he was just out there having fun, but it wasn't a lot of fun.
No, it's not.
Having sort of spoopy. And then when my husband and I did the first Northwest Passage cruise with Crystal, they had helicopters. They had all this tech, and because they were worried about ice, and they had hired this Russian or tremendous British icebreaker to go with them, and all the rest of it. Anyway, and they took people up for flights. some guy had smuggled a drone aboard the ship, and the captain actually stopped the ship and grounded the helicopters and sent security to find this guy and take his drone because it was interfering, with, and then you've read about them doing this in airports. Where is it? In Gatwick? There's some idiot, that was out flying a drone around Gatwick, and also, they can really be dangerous in the hands of people who just think they're having fun.
Absolutely, and more importantly, or more frighteningly, the people who are intentional. These off-the-shelf drones you can buy at any hobby store. Trust me, ISIS is using those. Every bad guy or gal that you can think of has access to drone technology and is probably deploying it. And you can put on very powerful explosives in very small packages and do horrific things. Drone Threat, my last book in the series, was exploring that. Yeah, it's it's a fascinating technology. When you think of drones, I think cutting edge stuff, but don't forget that the first drone patent was issued to Nikolai Tesla in 1898 for a radio-controlled boat. So it's actually that old of a technology, but reimagining it and putting things like missiles on it suddenly changes the game.
Nikolai Tesla was a genius. Few of us know as well as we should. He was really remarkable. I can also tell you that you can use drone technology to check your roof to see if you need a repairman to go up there and replace your tiles. My husband hired some guy to come out and fly and unnerve the neighbors, but to fly the drone over the house because you're not parachuting to go up there and clamber around your roof. Really bad things can happen if you're up by your roof. So there are some great applications for it, but also some really horrible ones. I think you have an unlimited future ahead of you if you go back to drones. That's the whole reason I wrote out about all that. Now, does anybody have questions they'd like to ask? Come on, Barrett. I've never known you not to have a question.
I was fortunate to know Larry Bond and John Gresham early in Tom's career. I wonder if you've dealt with either of them.
I have not. No, unfortunately. I never got a chance to meet Tom Clancy either, unfortunately.
Oh.
When people ask me what I do for a living, as someone did on the plane today, I said I sit in a room by myself and talk to imaginary people. And that pretty is mostly what I do.
Work if you can get it.
Yeah.
I sit in the room and talk to dead people.
Sure, they called security and had them waiting for you at the airport. Did you have a question?
Yes, I was just wondering, have you been considered to offered an opportunity to write just solely on Jack Ryan Sr.?
That's very kind of you to ask, and a good question. Mark Cameron does the Jack Ryan Sr. series every fall. They hired me to do the junior series for the summer, and so that's the arrangement right now. And the Clancy estate, Tom Clancy passed away unfortunately in 2013, and so the estate has kept the franchise going. They have the Amazon series now on Amazon Prime. Just the other day, someone said, I love the Jack Ryan Jr. series on Amazon Prime. Well, it's not Jack Ryan Jr., it's John Krasinski, who's a young guy, but he's actually senior. So they just reimagined that whole series all over again in modern times.
So can I ask you, what's it like in the negotiation over what happens next in the story? You're not a totally free agent. You can't have, if Jack Ryan Jr. went over to ISIS in the next book, you might be out of work.
Unless it was an undercover operation.
Right.
No, you're exactly right. Essentially, the mandate I was given, I was invited to like the world's tallest toy store. I mean, it's like the coolest place with the awesomest toys in there. And Tom Colgan, the series editor, opened the door very nicely. He let me inside, and he said, "There's no one else here." He closed the door behind me, he locked it, and through the glass he said, "Have fun and play, but don't break anything." So yeah, there's a couple of rules. The President Ryan is never, ever going to be part of the caliphate, and I don't want him to be, and he won't be. But beyond that, I was given total freedom. Whatever interests you, what you're passionate about, and most importantly said, because I would have taken the job, but Tom flat said, "Don't even think about trying to write like Tom Clancy, because you can't do it." And I said, "I agree. Tom Clancy was an original. You can't imitate an original, so I would never even think about trying to do that." So I'm grateful that I don't have to do that. Of course, my number one criticism I get is, "Well, you're not Tom Clancy." You're right. I admit that, and fully, yeah, he was a genius, and he was an original. I'm just following his wake, but boy, I'm having a good time.
So Mark comes here with the other series, and he usually publishes actually in December.
Yeah, okay, it's November,
Yeah.
December, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's early December, so you have a chance this December to come back and talk to him about that. So, I mean, do you read Mark's books? Do you try to
Absolutely.
keep track so you don't run into something unfortunate?
Yeah, I'll read typically his first draft as he's going along, so that when I start gearing up,
Right.
we're not stepping each other's toes. But
Exactly.
there's no mandate from some secret Tom Clancy headquarters. You know, here's your next mission. You must write this. Complete freedom to tell the story we want to tell, and the places we want to say, and the themes we want to explore.
Okay, but is there a big chart on the wall someplace with the history of father and son, so that, like,
right here, buddy.
you know, if he's right-handed for 6 volumes, does he turn left-handed in the 7th volume, that sort of thing?
Trust me, I spent a goodly amount of time doing research, and by the way, fans have done even more. There's a lot of stuff on the web that will tell you everything you need to know about everything. But I've done as much back reading as I can, but Tom Colgan, the series editor, is kind of like the brainiac overseeing all of this. So there's lots of different eyes on the franchise to make sure we don't stumble over ourselves too much. But
Let me add something too for those of you who may be wondering. Authors can decide before they die. Well, obviously before they die. Sorry, that was really stupid. Authors get to decide whether they want their work to continue, and generally, it's done to provide income for their heirs or for a charity or something. The Sherlock Holmes estate forever has supported some sort of charity and all. So, if an author sets that up with a literary executor, it can go on. So the contract that they have is really with the Clancy estate, and publisher Putnam is the publishing arm of it. But Putnam can't just like at random have one of its authors who dies and say, you know, we're going to do this, unless they have some sort of legal setup generally from. So when Robert Parker died, you know, there are 3 Robert Parker continuations, but other authors have gone away and taken their characters with them, and either they didn't set that up, or it's also possible that the franchise wasn't sufficiently profitable for the publisher to want to, you know, to buy the rights from the estate. So you can't just arbitrarily do this. There's another whole thing called fan fiction, which is a more difficult area where sometimes fans decide that they want to co-opt, you know, some famous thing and write on, and that's a much more difficult thing to police, and it comes up.
So do those estate rights expire at some point with copyright somehow, or could
Well,
they go
the
on
estate
forever?
can renew them. So copyright is it's been modified in my lifetime. I used to work at the Library of Congress and did a tour of the Copyright Office, and much of what we did then has, you know, been superseded. So I think, yeah, I'm really hazy on this, but I think if the work continues and the estate renews the copyright, it can go on for longer than just the original copyright, but I might be wrong. So we'll find out. So, young Patrick King, do you want to come and let me say goodbye to our Facebook audience as you turn off the camera? This has been a really